Hello, my name is Holly Morgan. I'm an academic coordinator and teacher trainer at English Path. In this gallery teachers session, we will look at emerging language, what it is, when to deal with it, and how to deal with it in the classroom. In today's session, we're going to look at emerging language. It's a really important topic within the English teaching world, and it's especially important for our students who always have lots of questions about language, when to use it, how to use it, and so it's something we really need to respond to within the classroom. So in today's session, we're going to look at what is emerging language, the different types of emerging language, what the difference is between target language and emerging language, which are often sometimes confused and are quite similar in many ways, the difficulties with dealing with emerging language in the classroom, how we can listen for emerging language as teachers. What are we listening for when we say that we're listening for emerging language? How to share it with our students, and leading on to the power of board work, and finally a summary. So let's start with the first question. What is emerging language? Well, to emerge means to become apparent or prominent. So therefore, emerging or emergent language is the language that emerges during a class. Things that come up, questions that students might ask, or gaps that you might notice. It is unplanned language, or language that comes up in the lesson. So we don't know what's going to happen, what questions the students are going to ask, or what gaps we're going to notice. So we can't always sit down and prepare for it in advance. And the main idea of emerging language is it helps students to fully express their ideas or upgrade their current language use, trying to give them a bit more, a bit extra than just what's in our textbooks, and really responding to their needs, as we should always be doing in the classroom. So let's think about the types of emerging language. First of all, we have reformulations. So this might be an expression or grammatical structure, and it might not be incorrect. You might hear something a student says, and you might think, it's okay, but I think they could say that in a better way. This is where we're trying to give them that extra, to show them how they could express themselves in a different way to express a very similar meaning. We then have language upgrades. It's again very similar to reformulation, but this time it might be a completely different form or completely different expression. So in this way, we're kind of demanding high. This is quite a big buzzword in the EFL world. We're trying to get them to do a bit more. So rather than telling them that they could go to sleep early or go to bed early, which are reformulations, we might talk about, say, instead, to have an early night. This is upgrading them, giving them a new expression. We also have what we call language gaps. So these might be missing grammatical structures or vocabulary which could enhance their language. So you might notice that a student is, not using the present perfect correctly in some of their utterances that when they're talking in class. And so therefore we want to fit in that little gap, that gap of knowledge that they're missing, which would really, they can then go on and use that in many different ways. We also have the most typical questions from students. The most common question we're asked in the classroom is, teacher, how do I say na na na? And so this is where we can really help students, give them that expression they're looking for. They might be able to say something in their first language that they really want to be able to say in English also. So it's listening to them, listening to their explanation and trying to give them that expression if we can. And finally, clarification requests. So you might find this when students are talking together in groups or pairs, there might be a little bit of misunderstanding between them. One student might not understand what the other one is trying to say or express. Or it might also be a clarification request from you. You don't understand what the student is trying to tell you. You want to be able to help them express it in a clearer way so that they can be understood by everybody, including yourself. So, what is the difference between target and emerging language? So target language is the language which we have planned to teach. It's often textbook based. Most of us use textbooks in our schools, and it's something that as a result, we can prepare for. We can plan for it. We can think about our explanations. How do we want to explain a specific piece of vocabulary, or how do we want to explain the grammar point? Do we want to think about our board work? Maybe if we're teaching some grammar, do we want to draw timelines? All of this we can think about and really prepare for in advance. We know exactly what we want to do and when. But this is not the case with emerging language, because it's things that happen that come up in class, and therefore we can't plan for it. We have no idea what the questions are going to what the students are going to ask us, and we also have no idea the gaps that might appear during the class. So therefore it takes confidence and practice in the classroom. When I first started teaching, I remember being terrified if a student asked me a question which was not on my plan. But with time and with practice, it becomes much more natural, and it's something we should start doing as soon as we can because it really helps students. So, why is emerging language difficult to deal with? Well, firstly, there's a time pressure associated with lots of our classes. You might have a 30-minute class, a 60-minute class, a 90-minute class, and you probably have a syllabus to follow or a textbook that you're using, and you have certain things you need to cover. So, spending lots of time on students' emergent language, their gaps, sometimes can be considered not a priority. We often focus a lot on error correction. We're often thinking about things that the students are saying incorrectly and how to improve those rather than thinking about how we could upgrade the language they already have, which they're using fairly well and quite frequently. Also, we need to think about what language is appropriate for different levels. The emerging language that we focus on with an advanced class would be very different from a beginner class. And so we really need to consider that when we're looking at emerging language and what to teach and when. Large classes are also especially difficult. If we have lots and lots of students, being able to have the time to listen to all of them and notice their gaps is quite difficult. So maybe we need to focus on certain students at certain times. And also, once we've decided on the language that we think the students are missing, or the gaps they might have, or ways to reformulate what they're saying, we need to think about how we're going to display that and share that with students. And we can't prepare our board work, so we have to think how we're going to do that in the moment on the spot. So if we have all of these difficulties with emerging language, why do we bother dealing with it in class? Well, I think it's important to give learners more than the language in the textbook. We have books and they're very useful, but if all we're doing is teaching from the book, then the students could really use their book at home. What's the point of them being in a classroom with us? We need to be able to give them some extra. That's our job as their teachers. We have the knowledge and they want us to share that with them. We also want to improve our students' communication skills and to help them to express themselves. They get very frustrated when they can't say exactly what they want to say. And so we need to try and help them to do that and to make them feel more confident when communicating in English. As I mentioned before, we also want to demand more from them. We want to challenge them. We don't want them to sit passively in class. We want them to really be thinking about what they're saying, what they're reading, what they're writing. And it's good for them to feel that they've learned something and they've really worked hard in the class. And also, it builds trust in you as their teacher. If they ask a question and you're able to give them a easy, understandable response that they can then go away and use that bit of language, then they're going to be like, oh yeah, my teacher's great. My teacher answers my questions. My teacher notices when there's things I can't say and they help me to say what I want to say. That's fantastic. So, how can we listen for emerging language if we want to focus on it in our classes? Well, I think we first need to think about our monitoring. When we're monitoring a speaking activity specifically, what are we monitoring for? Are we monitoring for errors, for target language errors, or are we monitoring for emergent language? Sometimes we can't do both, depending on the size of the class. You need to focus on one or the other, and maybe that depends on the activity. Is it a speaking activity that's to practice a grammar point? Maybe then you want to focus on the target language, or is it a kind of a lead in, a warmer to a topic, where maybe a bit of work on emergent language could be nice to draw them more into that topic? I think really, if we want to listen for emerging language, we want to listen for the content. We want to listen to what the students are saying. What the meaning is they're trying to convey, rather than how they're saying it. Thinking about what it is they're sharing, their experiences, their ideas, and then it's much easier to listen for gaps. If we're just listening for errors, we can't always see where we could upgrade things or reformulate things because we're just so concerned with the things that are wrong. And sometimes there's this kind of emergent language error correction crossover. Yeah, is the thing that I'm listening for, is it target language or is it something else? Figuring out which one it is. What am I focusing on, as I said previously? And really a key tip for me is that if you are error correcting the target language, then this really should be on the spot correction. Yeah, emergent language normally comes from when we're listening to students during a speaking activity and we're writing down notes for delayed correction. So really, if we're error correcting target language, that probably should happen there and then on the spot, because we don't want the students to keep saying those things incorrectly and to have fossilized errors with that particular target language that we've been teaching. So really, the first thing I'd say is we want to give sometimes feedback on the content of what the students are saying, because we always, as teachers, I think, jump straight into the language work or the error correction. We never sometimes ask them, what did you discuss together, guys? What was interesting about your conversation? We sometimes go straight into the nitty gritty rather than having a bit of a focus on the ideas that came up within their conversation. So yes, as I mentioned, leading nicely into emerging language if we focus on content first. So for example, I have an A1 class and my student says, I have an animal at home. So maybe we talk a little bit about who else has animals at home, not focusing too much on the use of the word animal at the beginning. Yeah. Then once I've done that, I might talk to them a little bit about the difference between what's a pet, what's an animal. When is something an animal, when is something a pet? And then enhance that even further, build on their language by doing a bit of a brainstorm of pets, which animals can also be pets. And that's a nice way to build into emerging language, also looking at a slight bit of error correction with the incorrect use of animal. So another big question, I think, is how do we decide what emerging language to focus on? How do we decide what's important or what to share with students? There could be a lot of things coming up during speaking activities, especially with higher level students or with quite long 5-10 minute speaking discussions. So for me, I would say a lot of it is personal preference. You might be listening to students and think, oh yeah, there's a really great expression they could have used there that I would really like them to use. And so there's not a hard and fast rule for what to focus on. It's bits of language that often we as teachers find quite interesting, we want to share with students. I tend to do a lot of work on colloquial expressions and idioms because I myself quite like them. And also it's sometimes things that higher level students want as well. So let's have a look at what your preference is in terms of emerging language. So we're going to look at some student utterances. Okay, I want you to have a read of them and decide what do you think you would focus on within these utterances to help the students improve their communication, which is always the sole purpose of working on emerging language. So we have number 1, I do these things in my free time to relax me. Number 2, I had a lot of quickly hobbies, but I gave up after 2 weeks. And number 3, with practice, we can to be more creative. Just take a few minutes now to have a look at these and maybe note down some ideas. What would you focus on in these 3 sentences? Okay, so let's have a look at some of the things that I think you could possibly focus on. So if we start with sentence number 1, I do these things in my free time to relax me. First of all, you could do a little bit of error correction, to feel relaxed rather than to relax me. So I could adapt the sentence to say, I do these things in my free time to feel relaxed. I could take it a step further and I could say to feel relaxed or to help me relax. Maybe a slightly different meaning. So I do these things in my free time to help me relax. Another way of expressing the sentence. I could also upgrade things. It's quite a basic noun. I could change it to activities. I do these activities in my free time to help me relax. I could also look at this quite common expression, na 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 X relaxes me. For example, doing yoga relaxes me. I could also look at different activities that are relaxing. We could brainstorm that as a class, things like doing yoga, reading a book, having a bath, listening to music. So if we see from this one sentence, there's a lot of language we could get out of this if we pick up on it and focus on these things. So if we go back to sentence 2, I had a lot of quickly hobbies, but I gave up after 2 weeks. You probably noticed the error correction, the quickly hobbies. Okay, so we need a different adjective to modify the noun hobbies rather than the adverb quickly. It doesn't work. So perhaps I might give the students, short-term hobbies. I think the context of this sentence, this was about, doing something for a short amount of time and then giving up. So we could say it's a short-term hobby. For example, I had a lot of short-term hobbies and I gave up after 2 weeks. I could also give them the opposite, a short-term hobby or a long-term hobby. I could also give them short-lived, short-term or short-lived hobby. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about the difference. Is there a slight difference in meaning between a short-term hobby and a short-lived hobby? What does that say about the person? And gave up would be a nice expression to use, a nice phrasal verb, but they could also use quit. Yeah. I had a lot of short-term hobbies, but I quit after 2 weeks. And finally, sentence number 3. With practice, we can be more creative. So I'm sure you noticed the error correction with this one. We can't use to before an infinitive with an infinitive before a modal verb. So I'm sure you changed can to be to can be to make with practice we can be more creative. And this sentence, every sentence we can upgrade, we can make it a bit more rich, full of language. So here I would also have suggested to students to maybe use a quantifier, talking about how much practice is needed to be more creative. Maybe it's some, a lot, a little. So there are always ways, even with quite simple sentences like these, to really extend them and to make them think about how they can add more information to them. So now that we've thought about what emerging language is and how to listen for it and what to think about when listening for it, we need to think about how we're going to share that information with our students. And for this, I think there are 3 key considerations. The first one is, how do you make a note of it during the class? How are you going to note down all of these things that come up? Because they come up very quickly, they're very spontaneous. You need to have a way of recording them. Do you board it? When do you board it? How are you going to go about that process? And how are we going to do that? So if we think about first, how do we make a note of it? How are we going to write down all of this emerging language that's coming up during our lessons? So for me, some scrap paper or a notebook are really your best friends with this. Always having a bit of paper to hand, somewhere to write things down, even if it's your phone, somewhere where you're going to be able to make notes quite quickly and fairly coherently so you can refer back to them. I also like to circulate around the class, not spending too long in one place, making sure I can listen to as many of my students as possible, depending on the size of the class. I also quite often like to turn my back. You have lots of lower level students who are very nervous when speaking, who are worried about making mistakes. And when we're listening for emerging language, we're not as worried about the mistakes. We want to listen for the ways to upgrade, and to make the students more confident with using language. So sometimes turning your back and not looking directly at them can make them behave more naturally and therefore use their language more naturally. And if we think about boarding it, do we and when? Well, absolutely. Of course I want to board it, otherwise there's no way for me to convey that knowledge to my students at all. Giving it to them verbally isn't going to be enough. They need to have a record of it somewhere. And I think you should always be doing this straight after the speaking activity where possible, so it's still fresh. If you're asking students to reflect on things that they've previously said, if it happened 2 or 3 hours ago, or even 20 minutes ago, they probably won't remember it. And so it's less relevant to them, and then they're less likely to use it again. So keeping it fresh and doing it as soon as you can after the speaking activity. And when we board the emergent language, I think we need to remember some key things. Okay, first of all, I like to have a clear separated section of my board for emerging language. Often I have a column on the right-hand side of my board, so my students always know that that's where emergent language goes, things that come up during the lesson. And I try to keep it up there for the majority of the lesson if I can. I also have done this with a Word document, having that open on the screen so the students can see it. I always want to focus on MFP, the meaning, the form, the pronunciation. And it's not enough just to write the adjective they were missing on the board and to write just that word, to write happy. They need to know that it's an adjective. They need to know how to use it. And they also need to know how to say it so they can replicate it when they're speaking. They might also want to have some collocations. They might want to have feel happy, for example. I think they also want an example in context. Sometimes the meaning, the form, the pronunciation is great, but students often remember when they have a context to help them. So if I was using my example of happy, I might write a sentence that says, the students were happy in Holly's class. Okay, so then they'll remember that and they'll be able to use it again in different contexts. As I discussed previously, any related collocations, expressions, or forms. I might give them happy, the adjective, I will also give them happiness, the noun, giving them extra options. So if we have a look at an example of some of my board work, here I have hungry, which came up during a speaking activity. A student was trying to explain it and they didn't know how to say it. So here I've written the word hungry. I've explained that it's an adjective with the abbreviation. Make sure you teach your students any abbreviations before you start using them. Then I've got the phonemic script to show them how to say it. Could also highlight some stressed syllables here, or how many syllables there are. Got the definition, and I've also got a nice example. I often use myself in examples or some of the other students because it's more relatable and a bit more personalized. So I've got here, Holly is always hungry in the morning, so she eats a big breakfast. I highlighted is here because I wanted them to be aware of the use of the verb to be. And then I could take it a step further. So I could also teach them hangry. When you're the combination of hungry and angry. So when you feel angry because you're hungry. This is a word I use myself quite a lot. So this is why I naturally went down this road. And there are many other things you could have done. You could have also taught thirsty if they didn't have that. So there are lots of ways you can keep expanding and keep going with this emerging language. So this is all great, but you might be sat there thinking, I don't have time to do this. How am I going to do all of this and teach the syllabus and work on all the other things I need to be doing within the class? Well, I think it's all about priorities, what we want to prioritize in the classroom. So we do all use course books and we have syllabus, but I think we need to remember who's important in the classroom, and that's our students, that's our learners. If they need language, then we need to try and provide it for them. We can't ignore their requests. We can't ignore their gaps if they're not able to express themselves. We want to make sure we can help them to do that. And sometimes it might veer off from the course book, but if there's a clear objective and a clear reason, I think that's okay. And, as I mentioned, we need to react to their needs. We need to be flexible. We can't always stick to our plans. We have to be able to deal with things as they happen. And we need to make sure that we are reacting to the students and what they want and need. And yes, emerging language often does take us down a path that we didn't expect. Sometimes when I'm in class, I didn't think I'd be teaching the word hungry. But I think we need to explain to the learners why it's important, why you taught them that word, why you think it's useful, and to explain why maybe the lesson has taken a slightly different turn. We have our objectives, but they can be modified during the lesson. So make sure that you explain that to the students as you're going through. So to summarize, why is emerging language so important in the class? Well, firstly, it makes us reactive to our students' needs. It means that we're not only listening to their questions, but also listening to what they're saying in class. We're thinking about how they're expressing themselves and how we can help them to be better communicators. It also challenges more from the students. It demands more from them. They're not sitting there passively in our classes. They're getting lots of extras. They're getting more than just their textbook. And that, I think, is very motivating for students and makes them want to really work hard in our classes. It also helps us to notice gaps in their language. So if I have a class of students, I notice that the majority of them are incorrectly pronouncing the ed past simple endings. I know that that's something I need to work on. That's going to inform my future planning. Maybe I want to dedicate another lesson to it, or at least half of my next lesson to it, to make sure they really have that basic really nailed down. And like everything we do, it gives the language in the classroom a real life use. It's the specific questions the students ask us. It's the things they really want or they need to be able to communicate, to be able to express themselves coherently, and to have conversations not only in the classroom but outside the classroom that are effective and enables them to communicate what they want to communicate, which is important. So thank you so much for joining us for this Gallery Teachers session. And please check out the Gallery Teachers website for more workshops.